From offering 4 controller ports right out of the gate to helping shape the current world of 3D gaming, the Nintendo 64 as a whole was a super innovative console with games that were way ahead of the curve. So let's take a gander at some obvious and not so obvious Nintendo 64 games that anticipated the future of console gaming. We're not including Zelda here because do you guys really need to know that the best game of all time did some pretty neat things? But we will put the Red Man in as a little treat. Winback Covert Operations is a largely well-made third-person shooter in the vein of Siphon Filter, except if Gabe Logan ran like he had already shit himself instead of running like he was about to. It's also one of the very first games to utilise a cover system during combat that can nowadays be found in so many third-person action games. Gears of War is of course the biggest example, but many games in the 7th generation owed a debt to Winback. The gameplay is where Winback shines, kinda, although the game's basic plot of stopping a terrorist group trying to use a weapon system to obliterate the world is at least cheesy fun, even without voice acting. Playing as the brilliantly named Jean-Luc Cougar, I love that so much, you're part of Team SCAT, and, we can't say much else as one poo joke per video is about our limit. Winback Covert Operations, which is just known as Operation Winback in Europe and Australia, was and still is pretty easy to pick up and play, minus the obvious clunkiness of 3D action from the time. But saying that though, it's actually a lot more responsive than you might expect for a pre-Y2K third-person shooter, but its biggest flaw is probably that it doesn't have much source, as it were, not helped by the lack of voice acting. Winback is a pretty decent game overall, one that actually got a PS2 port a year later, and even a sequel that nobody remembers called Winback 2 Project Poseidon, but that was nowhere near as interesting and was kinda left in the dark. Hey, speaking of... While people generally agree that Perfect Dark is one of the best Nintendo 64 games ever, people sometimes gloss over why it continues to be seen as a gold standard for its original console, and that's probably because of the standards Rare set before it. As a spiritual successor of sorts to GoldenEye 007, Rare took the first-person shooter elements, the missions with varied directives, and the general atmosphere of espionage and stealth, and created something that improved upon its predecessor in every possible way, really. All with an original and compelling plot built around a secret agent named Joanna Dark infiltrating a shady corporation to rescue a scientist. Perfect Dark was a hit because it was very ahead of its time. The enemy AI is always worth mentioning, boasting a degree of intuition and understanding so deep for console FPS games at the time that it's still considered a high mark for enemy intelligence and challenge that new games can aspire to. Disarming opponents with an emphasis on stealth, close combat, and hitting just the right spot is another way Perfect Dark put itself ahead of just about anything being done on consoles at the turn of the 21st century, some 65 years ago. Multiplayer options, a stunning variety of weapons and gadgets, hub sections, and an incredible variety of campaigns and objectives are just a few more ways Perfect Dark left so many of its contemporaries in the dust. It's one of the best aged games of its era, so much so that we'd much rather play it than Perfect Dark Zero. Because yeah, we'd prefer to watch our own bodies be harvested than play that. Segway. Originally planned as an N64 launch game until Nintendo got nervous about the game's violent content and refused to publish it, leaving Kings of 90s Crimson Midway to step in 2 years later in 1998, Body Harvest would no doubt have a very different place in game history if it had been released on time. At least it probably would be a little better remembered than it is today, which is more deserving of an excellent N64 action-adventure game that has fallen through the cracks over the years. As a time-travelling, genetically engineered soldier, you're effectively humanity's last hope after a brutal series of alien invasions has rendered us effectively obsolete. Body Harvest has a non-linear structure that sees you travelling across time periods in what is one of the earliest examples of a 3D sandbox game on a console, and it's interesting where we'd be without it today. I mean, we may not have GTA. How so, you ask? Well, a major part of the connection Body Harvest shares to present games is the fact that Body Harvest was developed by DMA Design, who these days are perhaps better known as Rockstar North, who are probably toiling away in the Rockstar content mines to make the jiggle physics in GTA 6 more real than real. While it's obviously not 100% open world like GTA 3, because this is still the Nintendo 64 everyone, you can still very easily see the genesis of concepts that would become better defined as the technology improved, and then perfected by Sleeping Dogs. Make another one of those, someone. Please. While Super Smash Bros. Didn't invent multiverses or even crossover games featuring a whole bunch of famous IPs, they were making beloved characters kick each other's teeth in long before Fortnite made it almost kind of boring. Did you guys hear that Gunther from Friends is coming to Fortnite? Who cares? The success of Super Smash Bros., which basically boils down to what if Kirby tried to take Mario's throne as his own, was a clear influence on the mass of similar games that have come out since. Even movie franchises like the MCU indirectly benefit from earlier media like Super Smash Bros., but credit where it's due, the first 3 Marvel vs. Capcom games that came out before Smash had already proved that people really like it when characters from different worlds get together to fight and spam the same attacks over and over again. But Super Smash Bros. Was a relative novelty when it was released in 1999 for the N64, especially as essentially the first platform fighter that's now been emulated 1,000 or so times. The mass of Easter eggs and various references to other games and characters is another major aspect of pop culture that again wasn't invented by Super Smash Bros, but arguably helped people to believe the unexpected when it came to crossovers. We also wouldn't have games like Multiverses and PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale without it, so thanks for that. Thanks a lot. Aiden Chronicles the First Mage, with its turn-based combat and a mostly third-person perspective as you explore a sprawling world, was just one of a handful of N64 RPGs to release, but probably the most constantly overlooked. But yeah, look, we're not going to lie to you here, gang, it's probably because it isn't brilliant. But it does feel a little bit like the sacrificial step to get to where we needed to get now. The hugeness of the game's world, as well as features like permadeath and terrain-based combat that could even be influenced by the time of day, makes Aiden Chronicles feel at times like an early example of the RPGs we see a lot today. But it's that seemingly endless world that you can explore that makes Aiden Chronicles far more unique in its heyday than you might think. The game looks, well, fine for its time, but it's also unforgivably difficult in places, buggy as hell at times, and the combat overall is agonizingly slow. The First Mage, yes, unquestionably has its problems, but despite bugginess and some gameplay issues, The First Mage is worth exploring. The story of a young squire named Alaron whose search for a missing farmer begins a much larger narrative is one that's pretty well told. There's a ton of characters to meet and recruit, and most of them are fascinating and extremely helpful. The soundtrack is also pretty underrated, but it's that opportunity to explore a 3D world that is still impressively expansive today that makes Aiden Chronicles The First Mage ahead of its time. Remember, it's not only the best games that can also be the most influential. Before they became the creators of Sly Cooper and eventually a part of PlayStation Studios, Sucker Punch Productions made exactly one game for the N64, and it would be their first game ever. Yeah, so Rocket Robot on Wheels isn't one of their best remembered titles, but it's a fun enough 3D platformer which sees you completing stages and unlocking worlds as a robot utilising a variety of different vehicles. It's the part where your character traverses these themed worlds in various vehicles that we're paying attention to, because Rocket Robot on Wheels would be the first home console game to build its entire gameplay around a real-time realistic physics engine. That's nothing particularly special today, granted, but in 1999 it was almost unheard of. Suddenly you had a game in which the puzzles you face could only be solved with a respect for the basic laws of physics, including inertia, friction, and mass. You don't have to be an expert on this stuff to enjoy Rocket, but the usual rules of platform games from this era aren't going to apply either. This might be a cute N64 platformer, and although he is no Astrobot because nobody is, Rocket in particular is a pretty likeable little robot dude. But once you start playing Robot on Wheels, you find something very different to anything else on the console, really. You might be in heaven if you know your protons from your neurons, and let me tell you guys, I do not. Again, RPGs famously really didn't have much of a presence on the Nintendo 64, probably because Sony got literally all of them, but the ones that did make it to the console had a chance to immediately stand out for that reason alone. Games like Hybrid Heaven from Konami further stand out because it's one of the weirdest RPGs of its era, or ever, really. Owing as much to third-person action-adventure games as it does to traditional RPGs, Hybrid Heaven is an ambitious effort from Konami, but it's not one that gelled with a ton of players back in 1999. At least as far as the West is concerned, Hybrid Heaven is among the first console games to try and combine RPG elements with action game fundamentals. It's one of only a handful of RPGs that let you put enemies in backbreakers, and could actually be seen as a weird blend of something like Parasite Eve, Slow Clap's insanely underrated Absolver, and a bit of Final Fantasy, because why not? It's an RPG, chuck it in there. It's an impressive game for that reason alone, but it's also a fun, engaging, and suitably challenging release from Konami, but one that's definitely not for everybody. Hybrid Heaven will have you leaping around like a Tomb Raider game one moment and locked in a real-time RPG battle with monsters the next, where you have to seriously think about their body parts, and if you can put them in a crippler crossface. It's a weird one, but give it a go. With a dramatically different 3D depiction of this franchise than anyone was expecting, a lot of Castlevania fans simply weren't sure what to think of Castlevania 64. The game received a mostly positive reception from fans and critics alike in 1999, with a few standout bad or mixed reviews, but these days the game seems to have a deeper appreciation for trying to bring this series into the 3D world. Games like Nightmare Creatures, what a whipper by the way, and Castlevania 64 may not have realised it at the time, but both games anticipate the players who didn't mind when the odds are almost impossibly stacked against them in 3D, and also being big goths. As the Soulsborne staples and Souls-like genre developed later on, games like Castlevania 64 proved there was something fun to be found in environmental storytelling and really making your players explore that environment to figure out the way ahead. But we're not saying it's the Dark Souls of the N64 though. To put it another way, Castlevania 64 drops you off in the deep end from a challenge standpoint and then almost completely leaves you to figure things out on your own. There are plenty of fair criticisms to level against this game, but it's really nowhere near as rough as what you've heard. The unusual day and night cycle and specifically timed interactions with NPCs even precede Shenmue in the 3D space, so there's another reason to be thankful for Castlevania 64. Hey? Space Station Silicon Valley, the 1998 puzzle platformer with bizarre and sometimes brilliant creature designs that I somehow keep getting confused in my brain with Jet Force Gemini, somehow? I mean, don't ask. It's another fascinating game from the artist formerly known as DMA Design, and it's another opportunity to see these guys working with concepts that seem just a smidge odd in the late 1990s. Space Station Silicon Valley, or SV to make it shorter, struggled to find a large enough audience that would enjoy its weird sense of humour, strange designs, and gameplay centered around a robot that must possess different animals on a crashed planet to survive. Each animal has different traits that will influence both the platforming and the puzzle solving, so it's kinda like a little bit a 3D Wonder Boy 3 or Shantae mixed with Banjo-Kazooie. Kind of. Because it's a kind of hard sell. Space Station Silicon Valley saw disappointing sales, and it's really a shame that this inventive little weirdo is rarely mentioned today. You can kind of see why though. It was a little bit too obtuse for kids and a bit too childish for adults, at least on the surface of it. Beyond its forward-thinking innovations, which will probably appeal to you sickos who loved Spore and even jived with the Cappy possession mechanics in Super Mario Odyssey, it's just a really off-the-wall little game to pick up and enjoy for a couple of hours. Just like this next little game. Behold the Red Man. There's an anecdote involving the infamous PS1 3D platformer Bubsy 3D, in which creator Michael Berlin saw an early demonstration of Super Mario 64 at the January 1996 CES. Berlin was almost immediately struck by the realization that his Bubsy 3D was going to get compromised to a permanent end because Super Mario 64 was about to set an incredible benchmark. Bubsy 3D was being made when no one really knew how to make a fully realised 3D platformer for a console, and everybody was trying to draw on a canvas when they barely understood how their new pencils worked. Don't get us wrong here, Bubsy 3D still belongs as far from the warmth of the sun as possible, but Eidetic really didn't even have time to copy Nintendo's homework. Super Mario 64, more than any other 3D platformer up to that point, showed everyone how it should be done. You can't get much more ahead of the times than literally establishing a standard that didn't previously exist. Executing complex jumps with precision and excellent timing in full 3D worlds with a mostly free camera following along was now realised better than anyone could have ever imagined. Mario 64 remained probably the best pure platformer in the whole of the 5th generation throughout the rest of it, unless you happen to be a bit more of a masochist. And there are still people today that see it as the best Mario game ever made, if not the best game ever made. If you were around in 1996 or even felt its influence throughout the 2000s, it's impossible to forget the full impact of Super Mario 64. From its most beloved games to the more obscure releases, the N64 had so many groundbreaking titles, but Mario 64 may have changed the game more than any other 3D game ever has. You know, apart from that green man, obviously. No, not Luigi. Is he even real? Outro gang, we did it again. They say we couldn't do it, but we got to another outro. We keep proving them wrong. So that was our video looking at just some of the N64 games that were way ahead of their time. Be sure to drop your comments down below and they might be featured in a follow-up video. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures, and thank you for watching.